Hi everyone, Wendy here. I hope that you've had a great couple of months and the end of the year is going smoothly for all of you. I'm going to give a couple of lectures for this unit, and this first one I want to give some background on how contemplative science and social neuroscience has approached understanding the ways that we can relate to other people's suffering, and specifically speaking about empathy and compassion. And both of these lectures actually are going to be focusing on the work of Tanya Singer. You may have heard of her. She is a researcher based in Germany, and she's super fantastic. I highly recommend, if you ever have the chance to see her speak about her work. She's really wonderful. She's doing incredible, groundbreaking research currently, which we'll speak about in the next lecture. This first lecture, I want to give a little bit of background and some of her foundational work that she's done in the last decade or so. So she kind of broke into the scene with a big paper in 2004 in Science about empathy. She was interested in studying empathy. This was still kind of a new field for psychology at the time, and certainly it was new to look at brain imaging with this, because the brain imaging technology was very new then. So she was interested in understanding how empathy, particularly empathy for pain, is how it was studied back then. Of course, empathy is often in relation to the suffering of other people, so pain was an easy way to do that in a laboratory setting. So she wanted to understand neural networks underlying empathy. And I'll just go over this kind of seminal study briefly. She brought in couples to the lab, male-female couples, and the woman was in the scanner and the man was outside the scanner. And they both had electrodes on the back of their hand through which they could receive an electric shock, one or the other of them. And the women, as I said, were in the scanner, so it was their brains that were being scanned, and they did this because there'd already been shown to be gender differences in empathy experiences, and so they wanted to just study one gender. So the women would either receive a shock, or they could, through a system of mirrors, observe their partner outside of the scanner receiving a shock. And the idea was to understand if the brain networks were similar or overlapped for those two experiences, and to try to see how observing another person's pain and ostensibly experiencing empathy for that person would show up in the brain. And Tanya identified this network that has in some cases come to be known as the empathy for pain network. It's not important for you to know these brain regions or anything, I'm just showing them here. But the idea is that they weren't entirely the same between experiencing your own pain and watching another, but there were a system of brain regions that were the same between those two experiences. And so the idea was that, in a way, the brain is kind of mirroring. This was also in the early days when you're understanding how the brain has this capacity for mirroring as a way of understanding others. So when you observe other people doing an action or experiencing something, it's often represented similarly in your own brain as if you were experiencing it yourself. And that's a way it's thought that we can understand social interactions. So in this case, it was the same for pain. So a large portion of the pain network, when you're experiencing pain yourself, also becomes active when you are observing someone else experiencing pain. So that set the stage, and Tanya became interested in this and interested in looking at whether this could be trained or enhanced to potentially enhance people's capacity for empathy. So this is where she started working with a Buddhist monk named Mathieu Ricard. You may recognize him. He is a Frenchman who is trained originally as a molecular biologist, and then he became a Tibetan monk for many, many years. And I think over about 40 plus years now, he's been a Buddhist monk, but he has this background in science. So he actually, a lot through the work of the Mind and Life Institute, became connected with some of the early researchers in contemplative science and people who were interested in studying meditation. And so he famously was often kind of the first guinea pig who would help out in the scanner and help design these studies. So Tanya had asked him, she knew that he was really experienced in compassion meditation. She figured that since that is related to, focusing on other people's suffering, he may have, maybe he has super spectacular brain networks or something like that for this empathy network that she was interested in studying. So she asked him to come in the scanner and do this compassion meditation to see how it would go. And she was expecting to see this, as I mentioned, this empathy network, which this is just a kind of stylistic rendering of those brain regions I showed you on the previous slide. So he is happy to do this, and he goes in the scanner, he's doing his compassion meditation, and she's out in the control room kind of watching the images, and there's a way you can check even in real time kind of what the activations are looking like. And he gets into it for a while, and she's like, wait a minute, this is totally weird. And she stops it and pulls him out. She's like, what are you doing? Aren't you feeling the suffering of other people? Because I'm seeing this really completely different network that we know is related to things like love and warm feelings and affiliation and even the reward system. And so she's like, what's going on? And he said, well, I'm aware of the suffering of others, but I'm generating a motivation to help, and I'm feeling this deep compassion and sense of warmth and positive emotion. And she, was like, oh, okay, well, just go back in the scanner and feel the suffering. Just, feel the empathy for these people, resonate with their suffering. So he was like, all right. So he goes back in and does that. And lo and behold, the empathy network that she was expecting to see does become active. So she thinks, okay, I've confirmed this. This is great. She stops him, says, you're done. You don't have to be in there anymore. He'd already been in there probably for hours at this point, practicing different things. So, and he says, no, please let me continue. I need to go back and practice the compassion meditation, because that was so distressing for me to be just in that state of empathy where I'm just feeling the suffering. I need to go back and generate that motivation and that warm, positive feeling and the wish to relieve the suffering. So this was a real clue for her to start to understand the nuanced difference between empathy and compassion. And certainly she started, she continued working with him and piloting some things, and really got clear that there were these two different networks, brain networks, that were related to these two experiences. So, in further work with him and in the study that I'll show you in a moment, she really started to crystallize this conceptual difference between empathy and compassion. And this is how the field views it now, of contemplative science and in large part psychology. I think in the public, people may still often use these words interchangeably. So I just want to clarify it for you from the scientific perspective, how we view it and why. So with empathy, the idea is that you're perceiving the suffering of another person and you're feeling that same suffering. You feel the same emotion. It's, again, that mirroring capacity. It's a natural, instinctual capacity. When we see something in another, we kind of experience it a little bit ourselves. Whereas with compassion, you're perceiving the suffering of another, but instead you are feeling and generating a motivation, a really active state, a motivation to relieve that suffering, which again is a warm, kind of affiliative, loving feeling. It's a positive feeling. And Tanya was thinking that, in a lot of these professions of people who are faced continually with the suffering of others, people who are in caregiving situations or social work or mental health or all these kinds of professions, medical perhaps, where you are constantly working with others who are in a suffering state, those people often experience burnout, or what's sometimes called empathy fatigue. It's just kind of an overwhelm from being in the face of all of that suffering consistently. And so she thought that perhaps if you could help enhance compassion, that could shift away from this pure state of empathy and hopefully build resilience, maybe for people who are in the face of a lot of suffering of other people. So I hope that's clear, the difference. And I do want to point out that I think sometimes when people hear this, it can come off like empathy is a bad thing. And that's not at all what I'm trying to portray. Empathy is considered, it's certainly a natural capacity. It's extremely important capacity. If you don't have empathy or the ability to have this resonance of emotions with another person, that's actually what defines a psychopath. But I think the issue where empathy can become detrimental is when you're faced with so much suffering, and if that's all you have, it can lead to this state of burnout. It can become overwhelming and negative. So that's why she's thinking about this contrast with compassion. So empathy is like an essential building block to compassion. You have to have it in order to move on, move beyond, and generate the motivation. So I'm not trying to say that we should get rid of empathy, but rather we need to build these additional capacities of ways that we can learn to work with suffering. So Tanya got to thinking, once she started to really understand these differences, well, can we train these separately? And, how does that look in the brain? Can we induce plasticity in these systems? And can we change people's experience and the way that they respond to suffering or distress in other people? So here again, Tanya and Mathieu joined together, and the lead author on this project is Olga Klimecki. I just like to show the pictures of the actual people so you realize that they're real human beings. So they did this great paper in 2014, which I'll just go over briefly because I think it's an excellent example of how science can approach this. So this is the study design. They decided to train people in these two different capacities. So they designed an empathy intervention or empathy training program. This is just a one-day kind of workshop, 6-hour workshop. And it was really modeled on what you might be familiar with as like a metta or loving kindness practice, except differently in terms of the content. So you would begin with a focus on yourself and resonating with your own suffering, repeating phrases like I'm touched by my suffering, I'm in contact with my pain, really just getting in touch with those feelings. And then you would extend that to a close loved one and a neutral person, a difficult person, and then outward to all beings. So that structure is similar to how you would maybe do if you're familiar with metta practice, which I assume many of you are. But it wasn't about the wishing well. It was really just focused on feeling and resonating with the suffering experience in an attempt to train empathy, enhance empathic capacity. And so then those same people that did testing before and after that, and then they would come in later, a few weeks later, and learn a compassion training. So then this training was structured similarly, but now this was kind of the standard metta or loving kindness practice where you would, be in touch with suffering, but be repeating phrases and generating visualizations of, wishing, well, may I be safe, may I be free from suffering, those kinds of phrases you may be familiar with, and then extending similarly to a close loved one, a neutral person, and so on. So these were the two interventions for the affect training, and then they had a control group of just memory training. So they would also come in and do these 6-hour workshops, but these would be kind of more cognitive, attentional, memory-based trainings. And they did a number of brain scans both before any of the training and then in between the two trainings and then after the second training. So it's longitudinal in that you're measuring the same people over time, and then you also have these two groups. So what are these people doing in the scanner? They had developed a task. The researchers had developed this empathy video task, and now this is no longer about physical pain like the shock study, but this is watching short video clips of people describing or undergoing an emotional suffering or describing an emotionally difficult experience that they had. So this is more a social, emotional, affective task, video task. And so you watch these short video clips, and then you would report on how much empathy you feel and how much positive and negative affect you feel. And notice that they didn't measure compassion. I think that's because this task was actually developed more when empathy was the only thing that was the only concept that was really out there. So they only are measuring empathy and not self-report of compassion. But it's interesting, the findings. I'll just quickly run through them here. So after the empathy training, so here's this begins at baseline, and then when they come back in after they've done this training in empathy, they report significantly more empathy after watching distressing videos, which is not surprising. and they also report significantly more negative emotion. And then they come back again after they have done compassion training and watch also similar distressing videos. And now we see significant increases in positive emotion. No increases in negative emotion, no increases in empathy per se, but rather increases in these warm, positive feelings, like Mathieu was describing in the scanner, this ability to feel compassion and warmth and motivation to help. So just to sum up, after they trained in empathy, they reported increased empathy and negative emotion, and after they trained in compassion, they reported increased positive emotion. So this was very interesting, and then also you could, of course, look at their brain activations during these tasks, and here in blue, again, don't get concerned about the regions, but just note that the blue network is completely distinct from the red one, and the blue activations are what showed up after people had done the empathy training, and then the red network were the regions that were activated after the compassion training while they were watching these distressing videos. And these are, in fact, regions that are in these networks that we know. So the blue ones, after training in empathy, they activated elements of this empathy network that Tanya had identified. And then after training in compassion, when they watched the videos, they increased activation in this affiliation network for love and warmth and reward and things like that. So I also just wanted to show, this is some pilot work that led up to that study, but I thought it was really cool. It's kind of amazing. So in these orange boxes, you can see activations in Mathieu Ricard's brain when he was doing compassion practice. Again, don't get bogged down in these different regions, but these are just the different elements of that affiliation network that we were talking about. And then when they trained novices, so people who hadn't done this before, they saw ridiculously exactly the same activations in these people. And to me, this is just very striking because fMRI is a fairly noisy measure. And so to see these just precise overlaps of exactly the same activations in novices that had just been trained for short periods of time, and then, the exact same network that's being activated in someone who's been practicing this for 40 years, I thought was really quite impactful. So just to sum up this work, I think that the study I covered is great evidence that even just short-term interventions, remember these were just 6-hour practice interventions that were done, can produce reliable and consistent differences in the way that the brain responds to the experience of suffering. And this is good bolstering evidence that there are, in fact, really distinct neural networks that underlie the experience of empathy or resonating with suffering, and compassion or wishing the motivation to relieve the suffering. So again, to review, the empathy training resulted in an increased negative emotion in response to the distress and then activity in that empathy network, while the compassion training in those same people done later increased positive emotion in response to distress, along with activity in the affiliation network. And so this really suggested to Tanya and her team that compassion training might be very useful as a prevention of burnout for people who are faced with distress a lot. If you can find a way to engender this positive, warm, loving, affiliative emotion, that could really help with burnout. So this is the background that I wanted to present. Hopefully that'll set the stage for the next lecture, and I also hope that it might help you as you're thinking about these experiences of empathy versus compassion in your own practice and also in the way that you're teaching it.